Welcome, welcome. We have duped you yet again with a thumbnail. I don't know how we do it, but
Do you think these people that are consistently showing up now, and it's not even the thumbnail getting them, but just our hours of work that's bringing them back?
no,
I
no,
wonder.
don't be silly. Welcome back to Luca Tella's YouTube channel, the one that has 3-digit subscriber count. Still, no one unsubscribed, so we're still in the 3 digits, which is great. It is a pleasure of mine and Alexis to bring you this Aristotle Metaphysics series to continue in, in the rich vein of form we've struck. I think we're very much in the juicy part of the book itself and in our friendship. Today, I'm feeling very filmy and cinematic, and so it's going to be a very quote-laden riff and tirade session from me. And I'm going to start us off with something more philosophical than philosophy itself, which is Andy Bernard's character from The Office, who says, "I wish we could know we're in the good old days before they're over." And I very much have felt the spirit in the preceding week. I feel like we're in this golden period of rush and intersection between whatever came and whatever is to come. And I don't want to wait for some tragedy to happen before I'm like, oh, it was so good when I was doing that series with Alex, back in 2026. So I want to just have all of that now, and I'm trying to do that now, and I'm feeling it now, and I know, as are you. I'll get into the introduction proper, but welcome, Alex. It's a pleasure for me to have you here.
What a pleasure to be here. Super relatable what you're saying. And for me, what it feels like to be in those good old days is to have so much opening up, to have so much growth and expansion inherently, so many more areas that have an innate allure and interest to them. I've recently been getting a lot more into just fashion and new genres of music. And yeah, the idea of artistic portrayal and how that's all worn has just sort of opened up to me. And I went into about 3 different shops on the weekend and just upsold myself because I saw new clothes and I was like, yeah, no, that looks great. This is going to be a nice piece. And I see it as related to this project here of resembling a drive and an inspiration and pursuing a passion. And I think that innately doesn't want you to narrow in and focus on this one thing. It actually, through that narrowing, allows you to broaden out and then go into lots of other domains and see and feel its aliveness. So being reflective enough to see what it's like in the moment is as you've done is something very worthwhile to point out. Yeah, it's great to be back. I've been Hegel maxing this week. There's an arms race to get to understand some of these other critical thinkers in metaphysics before we start to discuss the ideas. So it's been a wonderful time, actually.
That's just serene to hear, man. I've also been dabbling a bit in the arts myself, and cinema in particular, and getting into fields like surrealism more, I guess, with a new lens, with some of the insights we've had inculcated into ourselves in this calendar year, and viewing things that I viewed in the past with a completely different lens. So much of our sense making is conditioned by memory, and so much of memory is highly associated with things like music. And how we categorize music is where we were when we first heard that song, and it just thrusts us back. So is the sense of smell. You often smell something really pungent and you get just launched back into the first or the last time you smelt that thing. And I've been feeling that with the field and the study and the artistry of surrealism, and kind of where I last left off a few years ago with that, versus revisiting some of those artworks, some of those movies that engage in that as a subgenre or as a style, and just really reliving and kind of reassessing and putting a new spin on it. So that's been really nice. I love that you've been Hegel maxing. It seems you've also been looks maxing, because look at you, like it's getting sharper and sharper. But the other thing I'll say is I seem to age like a whole year in these 1 week intermittent periods between discussions. Like I'm just getting, I'm either shaving off some years from the end of my life, or becoming an old man really fast. But since we're here to learn how to die gracefully, I'm kind of in the right boat anyway. I do not.
And it's all about identity shifts as well. So be it on, be it off. Hey, you're playing with 5 years of life right there.
Yeah. I love your phrase, I upsold myself. But yeah, this last week has definitely been just very rewarding, intrinsically and more recently extrinsically, with the amount of reach outs we've been getting and people wanting to engage in more and more engaging ways. So that's been a new high, as if we needed it, as if we needed to be more stimulated than we already are. Yeah, but anyway, on to the topic more proper. So today we'll be covering book Delta, which is what succeeds book Gamma in the Metaphysics. It's a completely different book. It's a completely different style and I guess segment before Aristotle gets into the juiciest part of metaphysics. I would say this is the beginning of that, and he's done all this groundwork and setting up of the scene, as we've acknowledged in preceding episodes, on screen now if you'd like to check them out. The last two discussions me and Alex had in particular were really riveting and engrossing, and felt like they were taking on a spirit of their own. I said in episode 1 that when you do a discussion and it becomes a dialogos on a topic like the Ramayana, it's said that Lord Hanuman is sitting on the shelf on the side watching you, and he's invoked and he's manifest if you're doing a good job. And it feels like Aristotle very much is like proud of us and is the third character in the room and is really here with us. And much of the Greek kind of pantheon of greats, whether it's across philosophy or literature, I've been thinking a bit about Homer as well, and I have some thoughts about him and how he might tie in to some of the things we've been thinking about. Also, with the Odyssey coming out later this year, shout out to friend of the show, Christopher Nolan. Thanks for subscribing. But yeah, just to introduce book Delta a bit, it's essentially an attempt from Aristotle to stabilize the idea and the concepts of language that are at hand and at our disposal to engage in metaphysics before we do metaphysics. So a book that I recently bought earlier this year that I want to read later is Immanuel Kant's A Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. And I was just thinking how apt of a title that was for book Delta. If it was called A Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, that's exactly what Aristotle is setting out to do. Give us a cursory, self-aware introduction or a lexicon of terms that we will use should we want to engage in any future metaphysics. And then he goes on to do that, of course, as well. In the Penguin Classic version that I'm reading, the translator has this quote that kind of summarizes everything that's come up so far and gives us a bit of a like one-by-one sentence account. And I'll just read that out now. Of the previous books, Alpha has provided a historical survey of earlier metaphysics. Beta has set a range of problems to give the flavor of the difficulties that a comprehensive metaphysical position should be able to handle, and Gamma has given an overview of the method and range of philosophy. Delta is intended to complete our preparation by equipping us with a kind of philosophical dictionary, providing the conceptual apparatus needed to follow the discussion of being and especially of substance. And in Lucatella fashion, before I hand it over to Alex, I will read out a quote to set the scene for the following discussion. And actually, this is from Homer, from the Odyssey, so that's kind of very befitting immediately. Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways, who wandered far and wide after he had sacked the sacred citadel of Troy. Many were the men whose cities he saw and whose minds he learned. This is, about the roving expeditions of a wanderer, of an explorer, someone who is, like me and Alex, curious, kind-hearted, very has a tendency to invite things in, but within reason, within limit, a fusion of Apollo and Dionysus, and I think Homer captures it really brilliantly there. So over to you, sir. Any thoughts on that quote? And let's, have a bit of back and forth on that, and then we can get into the recap as well.
Yeah, I'm totally ready to get into this episode. From what you've said, you've actually given, I think, a very charitable reading to this. In some ways, reading through a dictionary of 2,000 years ago might not seem like someone's cup of tea, but here where we are with Aristotle looking over us fondly, I think it's the right thing.
We need views, come on.
Yeah, we're not reading through an ancient dictionary today. We are looking at these fossils of human consciousness from the highest highest forms of thought that were available 2,300 years ago, and we're going to break them open and look at the tensions that Aristotle was wrestling with the what he's trying to set out to do with philosophy and the concepts he arms himself with to get there. And I think throughout this, I'm really interested and intrigued to, use these concepts and the definitions he give, which are some of them a few sentences, some of them a short essay on the terms, because he's talking about some of the essential, the fundamental concepts and orienters for his metaphysics. So in one sense, we are really getting into the heart of it all, but in another sense, as we've alluded to in the last episode, these are concepts that have been extracted from their natural habitat, or they've been given to a natural habitat to try and understand it. So there's going to be a way in which paradox is at play here, which Aristotle so avidly tried to assert as not available. They're going to be dancing with paradox, because when we apply them to history and to thought and to nature, to organism, to physiology, we're going to see that they hold weight, but do they hold all the weight? You know, maybe it's the portrayal of thin Lizzie, but does it really account for thick Lizzie? No, it's funny. So yeah, it's already flowing here. And I think, we've had this metaphor of the campfire coming up. If you could see through the reflection in my glasses, of Alejandro's glasses, last episode, there was a blazing campfire. That's what I have on the screen in front of me, and it just kind of creates that warm vibe. And I think a little poem I wrote for this, which just captures like here and where we are. We've talked and joked a lot about, sitting around the campfire, but in the last episode, it sort of spun into, are we actually sitting around the campfire? Like, is that what we're doing? And I think to weave in and weave out lots of terms and metaphors from the context and spirit of this series itself, you could say something like, we're grounded in the ungrounded and bounded to the boundless, flipping the script on identity shift as we playfully tip the hourglass resting on our hips. All happening as the calm hours pass. The fire is lit and the quips are quick, but around the campfire, these bros do not sit, for they dance.
Alexis, Goethe, Shakespeare, Friedrich, Hegel. My goodness.
There we go. So it's dancing around the campfire is what this is turned into. Someone's brought the mega boom and we're just having a rave.
Mixed with grime in there for good measure.
Yeah.
So quick thing on that. Yeah, we definitely, with the campfire analogy and lived reality, we're trying to move away from armchair philosophy and armchair academia and more towards excavation and digging things up, unearthing them, playing with them, setting them back. We use this terminology a lot in the preceding episodes where we spoke about like a noble neutrality or a healthy detachment, vairagya from Sanskrit. This idea that you can, I am the sky, these are just passing clouds, without, dissolving your identity altogether. See what is the core, see what is the immovable and unshakable part of yourself. Hold on to that, but everything else is kind of up for grabs and up for leela and engagement in play. So yeah, I think we're doing that justice so far, and that's what we intend to do and really reached a crescendo with in the last couple episodes. So yeah, our role is less investigation, more excavation, and see where that takes us. And there's also the idea that you can't, once you pick something up and you put it down, it's not the same you, it's not the same item, it's not the same down. Reminds me of Baudrillard's quote about a demographic promotion being another step towards symbolic extermination, and kind of the paradox is laden within picking and dropping things as well. So yeah.
So as we said, we're getting into book Delta today, and we had kind of preemptively in the last episode thought, okay, here we go. We're actually, the ball's finally moving here. We're on the court. Aristotle's playing ball. and then we get through that episode, we come here and we say, oh no, wait, he's actually got some more clarifying to do. He's got some more terms to provide, and then we carry on. I've read ahead, and I can now definitively say that the next episode is where substance comes into the picture and we start to work with the terms. But first, we really need to understand the terms that we're working with. And I think there is a lot here. There's a lot that we can do with these concepts and understanding how a concept evolves and transforms over time, how it has a life of its own, and how the spirit of humanity can be seen in its highest form in some of these expressions. But then over 2,000 years, is that spirit of humanity destined to change? Is the same logic destined to hold? Perhaps not. But these concepts, how can we see where they are today and trace back to their origin point in the high point of Greek culture and Aristotelian philosophy? So there's a lot packed in here. I think I'll just get us into the summary from last episode, and then we can move forward. And for me, last episode was really one of my favorites, probably for the quantity of times that Hegel's name was said, and by extension, Hegel's concepts that were discussed. And like, I was taking some notes down of what we talked about in the last episode, what's going to be good for the recap. Get to when we start talking about Hegel, and it's just like one liner, and it just opened up into such a foray of just real philosophy nerd stuff, but like an amazing capture and synthesis and like in-working of Hegel. So really cool to have that be happening in the pod, and even when listening back, be learning more and deeper things about like what we discussed. So last episode kind of went as follows. We were embarking on the study of being qua being on Aristotle's back, seeing where he takes us. And the first place was on the outset deciding really that we are looking at the study of existence and being in and of itself without a prior reference. Obviously, we're trying to get to the fundamental things about nature and about our cosmos, and so we don't want to be doing philosophy at a level where there's things that are necessarily underpinning it. We want to get to the base level, and for Aristotle, it's being. It's a study of first philosophy is the study of existence itself. Special sciences have a particular remit, a particular focus on top of that. But the metaphysics means before physics, means essentially before the study of nature. You have to understand that baseline, the substrate and the substance that informs the latter. And we also had some discussion around how it's actually, philosophy is in the unique place to be able to be the subject of exploration, which goes to that position. I guess the philosophical subject is one that has no determination by categories, because it's the nature of its inquiry is to the category itself. So it's less about finding categories and then using them, applying them, and it's almost a study on the nature of category itself and then what we can deduce from that. So its object of study is very much directly how objects of study arise. And so it's in pole position, as we said, to study things that don't fit inside category, to study the boundaries and the limit conditions of human understanding, because it is philosophy that takes us there in the first place. And it was interesting how this idea of enabling constraints and disabling constraints kind of came up. Limiting constraints, how there's certain limiting constraints to the special sciences. For biology, the theory of evolution is, something that you can't essentially do away with, because it's such a strong force in what we're talking about. In in physics, you are constrained by the laws of physics, from where this Platonic realm, but you are, putting yourself in there and you can't do away with them, but you also don't then start doing theory of evolution stuff. You kind of stay within your realm and you're limited by that frame and that scope. And the thing about philosophy is it still has a constraint, but its limiting constraint is that it has to push beyond the bounds of what we knew. From that poem, bounded to the boundless. It has to be taking us further. Otherwise, it's just common knowledge or common sense, and that doesn't satisfy a philosopher in some sense. There have to be pushing it in some way. And we got into then how Aristotle was talking about being after defining this as the subject of what we're talking about, and he used this analogy of health to show how health has many different senses to the word. You could be a teacher of health, you could be trying to get healthy, you could be studying it, you could be observing it in someone else. And although there's many different senses of what health is and means, we all use it in a way where it has an internal coherence and it has a existence underneath all of these, or above all of these uses that connect it together, but also helps to point to the underlying nature of health, and in a way where it's not confusing it or making it harder to understand, but the different examples and the different aspects are enabling us to understand it. And so there's a kind of analogy there of how we can come to understand being, and that we can know that it's going to have different attributes, show up and look and feel in different ways, but at its core there is one thing that we can know and attempt to understand. And it's then in this book that Aristotle goes on to discuss the law of non-contradiction. And it's kind of an interesting move because Aristotle's starting off in a very continental fashion. He is, I think through his discussions of being, he's been very much in the continental tradition, with his notions of substance even later. Like, we know that there's he's going to the very basis of something, and what substance is a presence and a there-ness. It's very much something that's not able to be reduced to analytic categories. But what he does with the law of non-contradiction is try and formulate a logic in analytical categories. So it's on a linguistic and logistic basis. And I think that's partly where his weakness is, to try and ground something like a whole project of philosophy and metaphysics into analytic and logical truths, mean that, are those logical truths bound to the boundless, or are they bound to time? Are they limited to time and only understandable in one specific sense? Does the logic of Aristotle continue to be the same logic that we use today? And it's not. It's been redacted and updated and revised. I mean, it did stand for over 1,000 years, but modern logic today, uses different models. And I think that's sort of where his weakness came from. And he did preemptively want to, he did deal with some of the criticisms of his idea of logic. And some of them came from the sophists, and some of them came from Heraclitus. And he dealt with them pretty effectively because they were equally going to his level of this logic game and then trying to win a point there. But at that analytic level, for his time and place, Aristotle's logic and law of non-contradiction was very solid and watertight, so to speak. It's only through the progression and development of human consciousness that we start to understand where its cavities are and where we can kind of fill it in with different things. But so he does defend his position against some of the early Greek thinkers. And one of the ways he does this is by trying to refute the law of non-contradiction is itself like it's a paradoxical move to try and refute it, because the moves you can make to refute it just essentially strip what you're saying of any semantic content and meaning. If you're trying to go against the law of non-contradiction, you lose any internal coherence of what you're saying. Like if you're trying to say that I don't think the law of non-contradiction holds, there can be a lot of relativity. I think that identity is defined by the subject. I think that meaning is defined by the subject. Then Aristotle would just point out, well, if truth is held by a cognizing subject, if truth is knowable only in subjectivity, then you could equally say that your truth is that non-contradiction is true, or you could say that non-contradiction is false, and thereby you have no real way to make any claim to say that non-contradiction is false, because within your scheme it can be both true and false. So you're not saying anything, you're talking nonsense. And he moves on. So kind of undermines the attacks of anyone trying to negate it by just pointing out the flaws in the argument. So yeah, Aristotle's almost perfecting a little bit the Socratic method in that sense, where Socrates would question and ask further questions to deepen and understand paradox. Aristotle would ask questions really just to point people straight to the paradox of what they're saying, and kind of point to the impasse in their frame to take apart what Aristotle's saying. And so after that, we then sort of took the conversation into our own a bit and started to think about the ways that we do see paradox alive and at work and almost just part of our everydayness. And we did that directly to kind of, evict the law of non-contradiction from a place of, oversight or superior of status. And we looked at quantum mechanics and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, how there's a wave-particle duality that is at the heart of quantum mechanics. So when we're looking into material bits, like the smallest level of material, we find that the quality of which they are is both one thing and another thing, and they behave with both of those being a part of it. And it's only when you try and set it down to measure it that it will, that you can predict where it's going to be as a state or as a wave. But otherwise, it's more like a statistical probability that is almost inaccessible to logic and reason. And we also looked at how Newtonian mechanics collapses into an Einsteinian frame where gravity and time is all relative and interacting with each other. And so the normal categories that we thought we had are really reliant on each other, and there's not seamless borders between them. And it was through like deepening that paradox and really inviting that in that we became philosophy nerds. And you get Hegel start to enter the chat and has a lot to say. I thought there was a really interesting riff we had on, if we take philosophy as physiology and then we take physiology as electrical charge, what does that leave us with as a philosophical idealist? I think is an interesting.
Philosophical categorical is what that leaves us with.
Yeah, precisely. And I think what we kind of see here is in each of these paradoxes, we are seeing a progression of spirit. We're seeing the progression of human thought, mixed with its instruments of measurement, mixed with its reason, mixed with its mathematics, but all of which is coming from this innate growth and will to empowerment, one of these like real key universals. And I think Nietzsche would probably assert that instead of the law of non-contradiction, he would say, no, nature doesn't actually care if it's contradictory or not. What it cares about is this coalescence and discharge of even greater and greater wealth of input. And so there's a will to empowerment that's the innate drive of all things moving and flourishing and alive and not alive, is that tendency. And so within human history, there's this gradual progression of apprehendability, to apprehend. And it's not, for Hegel, it's not that we're getting closer and closer to understanding the pneuma. It's that we're putting ourselves in relationship to the real, and we're watching that evolve over time. So we're co-creating the realness of our concepts in our world. And like, it's that kind of line which makes him an idealist, because the role that the human mind and psyche has in truth and knowledge and reality is very fundamental. And it's not just material with an epiphenomenal consciousness. It's really paradoxically integrated. And I think then from that light, and this is when we kind of start to use the Hegelian dialectic to understand this, you can think of these contradictions not as, limit cases, but they're different hurdles along the journey to come into deeper understanding and intimacy with what is. And so you could see contradiction as birth pains of the eye of God, and birth pains of the revealed truth. And I mean, here as well, you can then see, okay, so when we're apprehending contradiction and paradox, and when we're apprehending something new, it's going to be painful and difficult and first emerge under this guise of something that we can't make logical sense of. And how do we first make sense of something before we can start to be logical about it? Is through that revealed expression, through art. So, and as you talked about the early impressionist art causing the riots, like it was this birth pain of the novel and the new that was very politically contentious, and rightfully so. It's bringing in so much more to life in this world. And so art as revealed truth was one of the things that we came to from this, from the Hegelian route, not even from a romantic route. We got to it from Hegel, which is, I think a much more harder feat, but, has a lot more substance to it. Yeah, and so I think it's then from there where we are wanting to look and see how much of Aristotle still holds when we get to Hegel. And my hot take on this is that Aristotle's logic and law of non-contradiction is something that naturally is like impressive and very well done for his time, but is something that can be sublated by deepening and understanding with more depth the contradictions of our time that we have today. And I think a figure like Hegel is probably a good way for us to help make that filtration process of Aristotle and find that it's not his logic that we need to preserve, but it is his concepts that we need to preserve. Because something like the Aristotelian concept of substance, which is the essential thing, the essential like nature of being essentially, had woven into it this own propulsion and like a construction of its identity through change. It wasn't a static thing. Non-contradiction is a static thing, but something like substance has an innate movement within it, like the duality between potentiality and actuality, as these concepts that Aristotle literally invented that we still use today. And so when we get to later down the track, we're going to see and find that what of Aristotle's is able to take us right through to today. And, we can still kind of be on his back as he, walks forward in the 21st century. It's not his logic that we're using, but it's his deep, ability to extend out into nature and to condense it and clarify it into the concept. And it's not a logical concept, but it's not a logical construct, but a concept that evolves and moves form. And I think to wrap this up, we saw that even Niels Bohr, who was a famous physicist and has done a lot in physics, tended to see it in the same way. The opposite of a true statement is a false statement, but the opposite of a profound truth might just be an equally profound truth.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect encapsulatory quote for everything we spoke about in the last discussion. And it is particularly and hyper particularly befitting that it wouldn't come from a philosopher as well. There is no philosophy that can be done outside, from inside rather. It can only be done with the help and the supplement of an art or a science or a technology. And I think the invocation of Hegel is necessary and unavoidable in a sense, enjoyable, but yeah, also it's not like we can escape it even if we wanted to. I think it's quite heartwarming at a time of mass meaning crisis for most people to have Hegel construed in a way where there is this possibility in our ideology that it's within the constraints of possibility to have knowledge through pure reason of the absolute. Now we want to get there. That changes. It shifts. It moves around. Much of the phenomenology of spirit is about this. I've heard it described as a picture gallery of shapes of consciousness as they move through process, and that's exactly what it can feel like to navigate what is itself navigating. And you mentioned with Aristotle why he's so steadfast in the principle of non-contradiction. He's well aware, right? He knows that there's going to be detractors. He's defending his position because he recognizes the need for logical grounding, because very quickly people that refute this will start to remove the rug from under us. I'm thinking of, like, I don't know why, but Derrida specifically, who just seems out to remove rugs more than actually do philosophy. He's actually there to deconstruct primarily and first and foremost. And you wonder about the intentions of that type of investigator. But Aristotle, I think, is prescient, foresees a lot of this. He knows how much tendency there is for the contrary of what he's saying to go off the rails. He's kind of privy to these valid counter arguments. What else was I going to say? Yeah, and then we also I think you did a great job with the recap. The one other thing I would say that really stood out was Aristotle animated. We saw him attack the character and assault the person who rejects his principle of non-contradiction. And once again, kind of just being accidentally prescient in doing so. And I guess that's also a Hegelian move accidentally by being idiosyncratic, because he's trying to connect something basal and analytical with totality as a movement, you could say. How do you do that? Through something like meta-consciousness. How does that manifest for the average human being? Reflection, put simply. Reflection for Hegel is a kind of unfolding, or it is the prime unfolding. So what the hell are we doing when we're reflecting on reflecting? I don't know. But all of our experience is shaped through ideas, and those ideas and those shapes of consciousnesses shift throughout history. So it's like trying to pin down a moving target, but that's all you can do. That's all we're put on this earth to do. So it's the impossible feat of the hero's journey in a sense as well, in trying to understand what Hegel was trying to understand. How does the shift occur in these pictures of consciousness? Is there a logic to them? Is there a apprehendable logic that's constant throughout time? Is something we'll be wrestling with going forward for the next 10 discussions as well, and kind of, again, unavoidable. I really liked what you said about pneuma. Is there a capturable pneuma? There's a riveting section in a Carl Jung book called The Four Archetypes I read about a year ago, in which he talks about pneuma and psyche as the cold breath of the spirits. As a definition of spirit, there's an ancient affinity in the etymology between psyche and psychros, and both are essentially just a variation on the word cold. And then he brings in the validity of the word and kind of tangential concept of pneuma as being something that originally transliterated as air in motion. So there's like a levity and like even Nietzsche talks about the lightness of feet as being the primary attribute of divinity. So there's like a levity and hovering nature to much of what we're talking about here. Semi-related, semi-not, but even anima and animus are connected with animos, which just means wind. So the word that comes to mind is rarefying. So constantly transfiguring something into thinner and lighter force or weight, but simultaneously moving upwards. So that's stumbling upwards, carrying your own ashes up the mountain comes to mind when we speak about the shift of absolute spirit throughout time, saying the same thing with a different lexicon, essentially. There was one other thing I wanted to say. What was it? Yeah, I also felt that Aristotle was, I think the person I most would want to see react to this video and our last discussion is Arthur Schopenhauer. And I think in the principle of non-contradiction, there's a kind of a buttressing but simultaneous rejection of both the Hegelian spirit and Schopenhauerian will simultaneously from Aristotle. If the movement is that, or if the energy is that any two spirits, whenever they combine, any two energies or instincts combine, it's a coalition and not like a subsumation like we spoke about before, then that's a radical shift away. Yeah, like viewing things as being here and not there, subject and object, and not one in which, yeah, ultimately difference and negativity serve totality is a very radical move, and one that's, again, precipitating a lot of future philosophy. Yeah, and where you come down on this idea of the resolution of opposites and how that pertains to the movement of spirit with a capital S and its evolution is very testament to what, I guess, side of the aisle you come down on. Is life itself with a capital L closer to a reconcilable multiplicity or an irreconcilable multiplicity? And I got the sense, if I was pinning Aristotle down just in the last section, that he would be 60-40 in favor of the irreconcilable, like things aren't moving to ultimately be subsumed. But yeah, we'll unpack a lot of that and more as we go on now.
Oh boy. Yeah. And I think it's part of that healthy detachment that we've talked about before is what is necessary to deal with these kinds of subjects. One of the things that's pointed out by Hegelians is that a lot of people reject Hegel just because they're not willing to be subjects that can tarry with the unknown and to deal with radical amounts of uncertainty. They'd much rather have their categories and, almost as just like having an orderly temperament, wanting to maintain that. And so it's almost, there's an emotional skill that goes along with this study and this kind of thinking, is to be flexible enough to not know but still pursue and follow the thread. In the same way, yeah, of like the paradox that sort of comes to mind is how we as subjects, we as people, just from 10 years apart, trying to find any like logical way or any grounded way that we are the same identity is actually quite hard to find when, all our atoms have kind of changed and who we are. We've grown up so much. We've had so many new experiences, and there's almost nothing logical about the sameness of identity that one has 10 years apart, but there's something true that still holds. And it's almost like making that just your subject of inquiry is something that Hegel is doing, but on the grand scheme of things, on the grand scheme of philosophy and the dialectic of the concept. And I think another thing that can be off-putting about Hegel is that he advocates for the primacy of dialectical thinking rather than intuitive thinking. So if you think that you can have that vision or get a revealed truth that comes to you, or have an opinion that you just hold kind of strictly, then you're almost in this intuitive space of believing to have access to a certain kind of truth or a certain kind of unity with the thing. And Hegel really asserts that it is through mediation of your ideas and thoughts, it is through conceptual mediation that you can actually see it progress closer to the absolute and closer to embracing more of the true nature of things, more of the paradox, more of the yes but, more of the yes and. Like that is the kind of frame that dialectical thinking offers to us. And it's partly because dialectical thinking is like a method. It is a process of movement. It is like incorporating the natural impulse that nature has to propel itself into the thought itself. So it's aligning thought and nature in a very radical way, in such a way that like the imagination and the intuitive kind of thinking perhaps doesn't. I'm not sure entirely where I come down on that, but I can see the intent behind it. And I think as well some other good kind of content to add here and connect it to our topic was, we've looked at Aristotle as almost having both an analytic and continental tradition within his philosophy, and we see that almost the analytic side and trying to get to like a universal logical truth is almost like his Achilles heel. He, like, if you think in the future how that kind of computational and logistic thinking is something that the machines have already gotten so good at and potentially are already better than us humans at. So there's a way that the speculative layer and the, I guess, embracing of paradox and thought is something that we as people need to do to, that's going to be the path for us. That's going to be the role we play for ourselves and for our contribution to society. It's almost like traditional forms of doing logic is, going to be subsumed by technology. It's going to be sublated by technology. Another thing that you mentioned was the distinction between how things move and flow together in time, like these concepts and like history and like materiality, is not through subsumation but through coalition. So there's identities that are brought together, but also the distinction is kind of preserved. So it's not that there's just a movement forward into a new whole and a new one, but there's like a sublation was the big term for Hegel. It would sublate what was previous to it. Something in later progression of history would, if it was like developing, would incorporate within it the old concept. You'd still be able to see that in some form in this progressive state, but it wouldn't be the final endpoint now. It would be different. And so when we're reading Aristotle in this sense, we also want to not just like cast the deadwood aside, like we want to bring it forward and evolve it to keep it being relevant for times ahead. And that's what it is to be contemporary in our thought. We're not just sitting here and giving that historicist reading of Aristotle. This is what he thought. Here's why. This is who he was talking to. Even like this is the history of what has happened since. Like we want to have skin in the game. We want to have a stake here. We want to invite the spiritual community of other philosophers that have thought Aristotle to come and think him with us. And that's all part of the concert of voices that we have playing out here.
Absolutely, yes. I like what you said right at the start, especially about the danger and the courage needed to engage with Hegel properly and to dance with it, because he refers to perception as ontic liberalism. So there's a trait openness, first and foremost, that you need to be a dialectician, I feel. Go on, sir.
How many philosophers could go out and just have a boogie on the dance floor and not be ashamed by it? Like you need to have that grasp on yourself. You need to have philosophy as physiology to go out there and put yourself.
3, me, you, and Alan Watts.
Would be those 4 a.m. ravers.
Yes. So I'm very on the side of life itself opening up to us, knowledge being increasingly intelligible across time through shifting logics from engagement in the dialectic, and meta consciousness revealing itself more and more. Just to, it's not even devil's advocate, but just to kind of ground us a little bit as well, though, I'm reminded of the age-old maxim of, or the injunction that when a centipede was asked how he could walk with all of those legs, he thought about it and couldn't walk anymore. So just, yeah, the loss of instinct and the costly nature of that you apprehend higher levels of form and order. And what are you losing? You're not just losing disorder, you're losing instinct. And that's maybe those two are not the same things. In the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche spends a good section talking about the cloud of suspicion that hung over the first ever contemplative men to walk on the earth. He uses the example of the Brahmins and how fear had to be incited around them to keep people away from them, because it's so unnatural. It's so unpagan, I'll say. Those two are not the same thing, but it's so unpagan to exercise deliberately a faculty of thought, to reflect as already a reflector. Isn't it tautological to sit down and speculate? Yeah, that was one thought. Also, just like there's some section in Delta or maybe Gamma where Aristotle talks about in the first line itself in the whole book, all men by nature desire to know. The prejudice that he's striking just by saying that. You could argue all words are prejudices, but some are really so. And there's that idea that there's kind of like a self-reverencializing from humans on ourselves. We believe in the value of our lives as being, rational animals, those which stand apart. We take ourselves to be more important than the world and its composite elements, or constituent elements rather. And for that reason, sometimes we're limited even in our reflections, because anything that's outside of a 5-meter radius of ourselves, we can't actually understand or like will ourselves into being, or like dissolve our identity into appropriating something else to our own detriment. Things that are transpersonal are useful. Things that are extra personal are also, but they escape our notice and our glance. And so I wonder how much of this is an inaptitude on the part of the human being to lack an ability to fantasize sufficiently to partake and empathize with struggle, vicissitudes, the depraved, and kind of like the beast in man and in life as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Schopenhauer being the one that you'd love to have listened to this conversation. And in the last conversation, we talked about that example of a glass having water and not having water in it as being distinct and apart. I actually have a magazine of Schopenhauer with that very glass. He doesn't ask if it's there or not there. He asks if it's half full or half empty, because obviously he was a great pessimist. Also resembles an hourglass sort of figure as well. So
what a tagline. What does it say? Shop until you drop.
Shop until you drop, baby.
That's sick.
What I was doing on the weekend.
Yeah, upselling yourself. That's so cool.
Cool. Well,
I think we should talk about book Delta at some point.
Delta. I'm all for that. That's why I'm here.
Yeah, so I mean, we each in the last week, or as we were perusing the text, kind of highlighted there's 30 definitions in the whole book, or there's 30 definitions, and we kind of just foregrounded whatever seemed right and natural to us and stuck out for varying reasons. But one of those reasons is definitions that will need to get solidified and cemented going forward, because those are highly seminal concepts that need to be on solid grounding, because we know now very much what the dangers are of unsolid grounding, or solid ungrounding even. So yeah, I mean, I highlighted a few, so did you. Should I start with one of mine?
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that's really a central idea in Aristotle famously is potentiality, something having existing in potentia, and that being as real a reality as actuality. And basically, just to give a rundown for people that aren't following along actively, but only listening passively to our musings because they like us more than the book or something. But yeah, essentially what Aristotle is doing is giving us all the possible valid definitions of each concept, and starting from the most straightforward to the least straightforward. And he's not kind of differentiating, saying this is better or worse, at least in the ones I looked at, but just saying that these are all verified, accepted definitions that we can work with. So the first one he gives us for potentiality is, and I quote, "The basic definition of the primary potentiality, a principle of change in something else in the same thing qua something else. So essentially, he immediately bifurcates potentiality into internal and external. This kind of eluded me partially. I understood it and kind of didn't, but he says with the external, the source of change lies in something other than the thing changed. So he gives a very easy, grounded example. He says the builder has potentiality to build, and the house itself is simply the recipient. So it's not really the house that has the potential to be built, it's the builder that has the potentiality to build, to engage in that action. An example of the internal would be, what does he say? The art of medicine may be present in the person being healed, but not qua a person being healed. So yeah, he kind of differentiates that. Do you get that, like just like intuitively straight away?
Potentiality.
Well, this example specifically. So the art of medicine may be present in the person being healed, but not qua a person being healed.
Yeah, interesting. It's sort of what you had said, like that's the way I would understand it too, is that the properties of the thing that has potential for something is separate to the thing itself. The potential of someone being healed didn't exist in this ideal concept of healing. No, it existed in the practitioner that was able to, provide and do that for someone. So it's cause, like, where's the cause of that potential? It's from that source prior.
So he's almost like privileging the efficient cause for once.
Yes.
Okay.
I think here, though, it's interesting because, and I take this a little bit from a reading of the physics, was the way that he is using potentiality and actuality in the physics is, and I wonder if he gets to something similar here, is like a very imminent incarnation. Like the thing that something is has both within it potentiality and actuality. And its potentiality is like its material conditions. The thing it's made of, its substance, like you can meld and morph iron to be, to come into a different shape. You can craft a statue out of it, and it has that kind of potential of it. And then the actuality of what something is the form that it takes.
Yes.
So what it is to be that thing. And that's also where he would place the soul, like the soul of objects and entities and ourselves is like the form that we have, and this material conditions that we're made up of is something that's actually a little bit malleable and subject to change. And that's Aristotle's concept of hylomorphism, of two kind of existing qualities of something, like its potential for movement and its instantiation in what it is, that construct the identity of any one thing. And that's how we can have this idea of change so innate to everything that Plato was lacking.
Totally. I think to understand fully or sufficiently the idea of potentiality in Aristotle before we move forward, yeah, that term is number one, hylomorphism, that is. And I think you're distinguishing between the material and immaterially perfectly there. I think there is a distinction to be made for Aristotle. He also talks of geometry or arithmetic as something that admits of metaphorical potentiality. So normally when we're talking about potentiality in nature, we're talking about the material type that you outlined, which is the capacity or ability to undergo change. But that's not really the case when we're talking about lines, right? Geometrically, we're talking about when a line is potentially divisible, no actual process, like actual quote unquote process, is actually occurring. So yeah, that kind of brings us back to one of the most elevated questions in our discussions, which is if there is a distinction to be made between the mathematical example being like kind of immaterial and immaterial, are we, when we are engaging in this, are we uncovering the world or just uncovering how we talk about the world, right? That central question we've danced around for so long.
Yeah, and there's another distinction here that John Rusin points out in his analysis of the physics by Aristotle, which it kind of brings a new perspective to this question of what is potentiality, what is matter, why does Aristotle identify potentiality as the matter of something? And for John Rusin, it's like matter is your capacity to be in the world. Like that is your instantiation of the thing there, like to be able to touch it, to have impact and influence on its environment. And so it's matter is a form of potential. And you can think of like the human being, we have this ability to grasp things. It's sort of what makes us like quite different from the animal kingdom, like having opposable thumbs and being able to use our fingers for very small and kind of detailed tasks. And we only have that potential within us because we have like hands and fingers and opposable thumbs and all the ligature and bones and everything. It's very much in that level of the thing, the stuff that it's made of, that generates that potential of what something can do and what something is, whereas the form of it doesn't hold that same actual ability to influence things in a similar way that perhaps mathematics, when we apply and when we use it, can influence something, but in and of itself, it's not like causing things to smash together. It's not causing planets to collide. Like that's the materiality that has in its potentiality such large consequence.
Yeah, very well said. I like Heidegger's terminology here when he talks about gathering the ways of being indebted. And basically the four causes kind of being an occasioning, a proper mode of occasioning, I think he says, and kind of giving it a name or an umbrella term for the essence of causality itself. And yeah, it is very much alive and kicking in matter itself. And yeah, and then obviously you know, add on to that form and things and give it it already has a telic finality, but then you impress form onto it. But essentially the thing already exists and is alive. What does he say? Four modes of something something, but yeah, all present and alive simultaneously, essentially. And yeah, we can leave that there. But then I also sensed a bit of annoyance from Aristotle to do with the limits of language once again. He kind of says, oh yeah, and by the way, the other definition of potentiality is just the ability to do something well. If you can talk well, then people say you have the potential to talk well, but that's not what we mean. But I'll also allow it, is kind of the tone he had. So yeah, he kind of continues his animated presence in this as well. But yeah, that was kind of it on potentiality. We can move on unless you'd want to add something.
I think the last thing I'll add here is just that, you know, in future episodes of the pod, we're going to dedicate a good amount of time to talking about the relationship between potentiality and actuality. Aristotle dedicates an entire chapter to it. It's so fundamental to his unfolding substance. It's so fundamental to the process of change in his metaphysics. And hey, we're all still using these concepts today. So he's really found some things that, as we've said, have stood the test of time, of the progression of human spirit. That's still very much fundamental to our understanding and to talking about things, you know. And when people aren't living up to their potential is, you know, something that you may only hear Jordan Peterson say today, but someone is still saying it. And with actuality as well, like, yeah, they're concepts that we use a lot. And yeah, we're going to hear more of it in the future down the line.
All right, I'll do one more and then you do yours, okay? The other one that really stuck out to me of his definitions was necessary / necessity. How do we define what is necessary, essentially? He starts straightforwardly once again. He says what is necessary is what is a clear causal contributor for life. Gives a very standalone example, basically. So nutrition is one, because you can't live without nutriment, I suppose. Respiration for any living animal, including human beings. So clearly, no one would argue that the ability to breathe is necessary, because we just have a latent presupposition that life is better than unlife. What is necessary also can be defined as the precondition for the production of good or for the removal of evil. This one was more interesting. He says, medicine is necessary insofar as we want to be not ill. So for the removal of evil, if illness and ailment is like an imposition and a malady unto us, then what is necessary is what removes that, say, decentering or below equilibrium state and restores us back to equilibrium. So also immediately intuitively graspable, which is nice for once. Any thoughts on that? And then I can give you the last definition, which is the most interesting, actually.
No notes for once.
Okay, awesome. Right, I'm gonna have to clip that out and use that everywhere. Something is also necessary when it cannot be otherwise, and this I actually got partially from rereading parts of the Poetics, which is another book Aristotle wrote, kind of his treatise on aesthetics, you could say. Not really, but that's the closest approximation. So something is necessary when it is primary and fundamental because it cannot be in a plurality of states, going explicitly contra to what we spoke about with the introduction or advent of superimposition as an idea in the last episode. So he actually says something is necessary if it cannot exist in a plurality. It's a bit of a nod to science in general, science of his time, perhaps, because he speaks of science as being the demonstrative act, and science is necessary because it speaks of things that cannot be otherwise. So, yeah, that's kind of the phraseology he repeats and the locution that will be of primary importance going forward, as well as what is necessary is that which cannot be otherwise, science being a prime example.
So are you reading that as science is a prime example of something which is necessary because it can't be otherwise?
Sorry, no, science is the study of things that are necessary.
Yeah, right. Like what is causing something to happen? Like what necessarily had to happen for, you know, A to lead to B. And I think for Aristotle as well, it's important that when he says the word science, he's probably saying techne, which is more like artful craftsmanship, but like applied craftsmanship. So yeah, is kind of he's doing a proto science, and I think it is just the point to make there is it's much more grounded in like the kind of practicalities of every day rather than just being an academic in a lab and still doing science. Like it's no, you're like thrown in the world and making sense of it. That's what science is for Aristotle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's something that shouldn't be lost on people listening as well. You know, it's closer to phronesis. The terminology to us is rather foreign, but science of wisdom, it's kind of used in that spirit. Definitely not man in lab coat trying to get to the bottom or the center of the earth or something. I think the extractable principle here for Aristotle is simply indisputability. What is necessary is that which cannot be otherwise. And we're just talking about things that are indisputable. And largely, like there's always going to be exceptions. Every rule has an exception. Every norm has an abnormal instantiation. But even you can kind of shoehorn the quantum superimposition idea into this and say that it is indisputable that things can exist in a plurality. And he's more interested in the extraction of that more than that things exist plurally. Yep, that was the second one. On to you, sir.
Cool. I've got a few as well, and I've tended to have the concept there and then give the different definitions or the different senses that Aristotle presents for this. There's an interesting method that Aristotle uses to define these terms and to give examples of them. He uses a series of different references. He uses a series of different senses to the word to then like show its reference. And this was coming to me just as you were speaking before and kind of reflecting on it, was the way that some language can be very poetic compared to others. And it's almost the way that, you know, a term has a very specific reference and can have many senses depending on how it's used. Also, depending on how it's used, it can have multiple senses functioning at the same time. And so you're revealing more of the essence of a concept when you're showing it, you know, this word, like in a rap, when something is said, like Kendrick Lamar, I'm okay with all these nines, and his diss track on Drake to, you know, bring some pop culture in. It's, you know, K for Kendrick, I'm okay with these nines also means like canine, because Drake's track was called for all the dogs, or he had something related to that, and so he's saying I'm a canine. He's also like a canine being a kind of gun, and there's like these different references woven artfully into like a specific word, and it is like distilling more and more of like of the concept. And in that example, it seems more like it's artistic, like canine is not like a totally substantive thing. It's, you know, artfully used as kind of word plays. But when we want to use a word not just as plays to something else, but to like deepen within itself, within that concept, we want to use it and invoke so many different senses. Aristotle, Shakespeare often does this, where each kind of line and phrase and thing that he's saying probably is reference to like two other places. And it's almost there's different ways that can be done, you know, through different themes or different structures of length, or different rhythmic patterns or different symbolic motifs. There's lots of ways to drawing out cross references. The Bible's almost the best example of being able to do that remarkably. And here it's like a similar form of Aristotle very, you know, placidly kind of listing out all the different senses to it. But what that gives us is that poetic way to encounter these concepts in Aristotle. We get to poetically be immersed in what is being said, because we know when he talks about potential or when he talks about necessary, we have these different descriptors of it, and we can start to feel them flow in and fill that concept as they are in future. So yeah, that's quite, yeah.
I have something to say about that already.
That feels good. You go.
Okay. Yeah, I think what you're really trying to bring to the table here is the worth that we don't understand and can only feel. We don't understand, I guess, in an articulate, sophisticated manner of literary devices. And that is something that is common across many fields of study and exploration. I'm thinking a lot about the skill, the rhythmic skill of rappers. It's really, really remarkable. And as someone who played drums for 10 years, I can really tap into the idea of enjambment, which is something I understood from Keith Moon, but that's the idea, very simple rhythmically, of playing over the bar line. So deliberately distorting and warping the listener or experiencer's sense of time and understanding. And this is done across the board with Shakespeare. He does this a lot in his writings. And you're right, in terms of being the most hyperlinked text of all time, the Bible is, there is nothing better in the Western canon that does it better than the Bible. They're not doing it on purpose to like get more views, but it's just done. And there's like plentiful examples there of it. I'm even thinking of the origins, the kind of evolutionary origins of poetry, and how most of what we call dead and buried literature, great, but ultimately dead, is stuff that was sung and orated and not written and spoken dryly or blandly. There's many utilitarian examples, or like rather there's a utilitarianism to the origin of poetry, you could say. There were reasons why they were sung, and they were sung in unison and sung in a specific style and prose, and not spoken and sung to by a certain group of people for a certain group of demigods or gods, right? Enchanting the daemons as we row our boat to Delphi, for example. So yeah, like rhythmic turns of phrases are important. So you have to and that's partially the kind of the utilitarian angle on that is just memory. How do you remember 1,000 words if there's no nice flow? How does Kendrick Lamar remember the words for a 4-minute song if there isn't a way, kind of a mnemonic device, I think. Mnemonic? I'll cut it out. What is it called?
I don't know. Mnemonic? Let me
see. Mnemonic device. But yeah, essentially tricks and skills that you have up your sleeve that allow you to remember, because you do wonder, how does a TED talker, you know, remember a 10-minute speech? That's so boring and useless, and that's why they've been invited to talk at TED anyway. But it's because they've got these rhythmic turns of phrases, elements arranged a certain way. It might seem obscure and inaccessible, but it just, yeah, essentially the way to counter unmetricality is through rhythm, and that aids memory. Another reason we had poetry emerge thousands of years ago, and really, I would argue, perfected in ancient Greece around the time, just maybe like 200 years before Aristotle, you could say, was to impress on the gods, like I said. when something is rhythmic, it can be heard at far greater distances because the way that we register sound in our ear canal is such that it just latches onto things that are repetitive, or it categorizes it not as repetition but as generalities, but you have to have like a subsidiary awareness of repetition for that. So if you're trying to beat your drum so loud that God hears you, just poetically, it would make sense that that's what you would do. It's also
That's so fire.
it's
That's
also
so
to
fire.
bewitch the gods is why we speak like that. It's also because we think we can make God our bitch. This is a very Promethean spirit that is contrary to our taste, I suppose, today. But we're applying a constraint to produce and generate this primal feeling of overwhelm. It's not just your soul, but it's also God's soul and your feet and your body and your arms that are swaying and are enchanted. And if you are true as a devotee to your God, then your souls are one and the same. And so, yeah, there's just all this stuff that's really, really cool on the origins of poetry that I think directly relates to use of, say, the difference between sign and symbol. What's the difference between Plato's allegory of the cave, or is it a parable of the cave? And that's like a seismic difference in how we understand those. One is manifold in its meaning, one is actually inexhaustible. Go on.
Why did Jesus only speak in parables?
Yeah, and can we call that speaking symbolically? No, because that would be reductive, right?
Yeah, and I want to read that book or watch that lecture, whichever one and even just it goes down to your applied knowledge and wisdom, but knowing wisdom is to know how to teach it. So put that my way after this. I think, and what you're saying, like the origins of these literary devices were originally done because they would bring us closer to talking to the gods, and like that was totally the reason why that form originated.
I told you
Hey,
I told you Homer would come up naturally.
For sure. And I was even this is partly like just one of that really nice side quests, like the on the way to where we're going. And here we're just going to talk about like the origins of poetry as dialectic to the god, and then we're going to look at literary devices used as an example of communicating deeper essences. And for Kendrick Lamar, going back to that, because I've now got like the final things, K with these nines, Kendrick referencing to J. Cole and Drake, is saying, he's a K with these nine. He's a king. His nickname is also K dot with these nines. So they're not quite tens, but they're nines. Here's also, the reference to the canine, the dog, but then also like in the slang for kind of an AK is a K, a gun, and shoots 9mm rounds. So he is like a gun unloading on his ops kind of thing. So like that's all kind of packed in, and that's why he's like a genius, and that's why he's like hailed as the king of rap. Cool.
Yeah,
well,
having like manifold meanings that people both read into in his fan clubs and glaze on Kendrick as they rightly should is only half of the equation, right? There is something there to glaze on, and that's why there are all these. Then there's a separate term of like maxim, maxim versus aphorism, and there has to be something there for you to go searching. And when you find it, it really does give credibility to both the quest and the question.
In that light, the first term that I will bring in is the first one that Aristotle discusses, and it's the beginning. It's the concept of the beginning. I think what's interesting about this is how, we can look to understand what he's saying here, even through the guise of, okay, what is going to be there for Aristotle in the beginning? What's going to be his essentially God that gets the whole project moving? Why is there being rather than non-being? And I think what we can see is partly what Aristotle is going to come to in that is this notion of the unmoved mover, right? The first cause, the first cause of which there can be nothing prior, and so some of these descriptors for it is that from which one would first start, that from which a thing would be best originated. And the example he gives is because the starting place is not always the best. Sometimes if you're learning something and maybe you're more advanced, you'd come at a different point. So there's almost a fittedness to where it's best for something to start, which is, again, it's not just like always back to the beginning. And it's like, okay, there's almost a coming into a certain process, which is like just right, so it's almost invoking like another standard of rightness, and maybe that's how he can have the wiggle room and this kind of definition to impose his own justification on something. He also says that the beginning is that from which something comes to be imminently. So it could almost be, the example he gives is the foundation of a house that's there, which gives rise to the structure above it, that from which something comes to be non-imminently. So just the inverse. And in a sense, what we've talked about of that non-logical connection to something that happens. But in this way, Aristotle's talking about, it's not just like totally like logically, visibly connected, but it's non-imminently connected. And he gives the example of a fight from abusive language, a child from parents. I think, Aristotle, like, I don't know if he was just being a little bit hostile in this chapter and being like, talk shit, get hit kind of thing to all his interlocutors. Also, that at whose will that which is moved, and that which changes, changes. So he's even here bringing the concept into the political sphere, which is, like, this was the whole genius of Marx, and genius, this is what he did. And if you read him in his originality, then he's a little bit more genius than what happens to his ideas as they get taken and instantiated. But he applies Hegelianism to material conditions and to political economy. And even in this one sense here, we're seeing Aristotle take this concept of the beginning and show it to apply to a broad range of like political life. Gives the examples of oligarchies and monarchies as being able to have that will to decide what is moved and what changes. And so that's the beginning of like a city being built, or a war, being embarking on a war was their essentially decision, their will. And finally, it's that from which a thing can first be known. So, e.g., the hypotheses are the beginnings of a demonstration. So it's almost, before knowledge is, before something is determined, the sense of it before, like how it is first known. So almost where something is born into thought is the beginning too. So there's a lot there. And I think each of those kind of definitions, you can go, that makes sense. It's a sense of a word, and the reference is beginning. And it's interesting though that it's again just what Aristotle said at the start of this, and the example of health. They're quite different, and it's really nice to have the examples accompanying them, because it really puts kind of meat to it. And yet now we have to do this process of like letting it all be sublated under this concept of beginning, and letting that all go on to inform what Aristotle's talking about when he talks about beginning. And it's interesting here as well that Aristotle isn't coming out and being like, with this golden tablet, here is what beginning is. He phrases it more like, these are the things that people tend to believe of what beginning is. Like, he very much naturalizes it. And he does this a lot in metaphysics. He's doing it so that it's not just all about him. He's more the empiricist, right? He's the radical empiricist. And he is observing and seeing what people are saying about words and concepts, and then just transcribing it. So he's trying to very naturally be like, this is the common sense. This is how people act. This is what people would say about what the beginning means.
I found particularly interesting the house example, and how the foundation of the house is an example of an imminent cause for what the house data comes to be, and how we contrast that with a fight emerging from abusive language being a non-imminent example. But I also wanted to ask you, do you think he's deliberate with his examples here and continuing on the idea about kind of like this explosion of engagement with all senses? Like, do you think he's giving us one example that's clearly like on the ground, physical and material, like a house being built up from scratch, and then giving us a verbal dialogue type example to say that these things exist like across senses and across all facets of your life? Do you see that? Like, is there a intentionality with his examples, or is it just a coincidence?
I mean, some of his examples stay through a lot of these. Like he goes back to the bronze statue quite often, and I think obviously the bronze statue is kind of something just revered and significant in their time. So there's a bit of his historicity in that. But yeah, I think for good reason. Like you almost, and part of what you do when you give an example of a limit case is try and find the limit case which is particularly interesting and revealing about something. You don't just give an example for the sake of an example. You give one that really interestingly brings out new differences and new light to it. And that's why there are famous and classic examples often of paradox and of different ideas. That's why they're preserved. My thoughts is, I think he's definitely intentionally stretching where he goes with his definitions. And I think just that it is coming from Aristotle, he's definitely going to have thought about this and clarified it. So I would say, I would lean in the direction, but I don't think we can do much more of a perfect assessment of this. Just it feels like, yes, he is being very specific in his examples, and they do have significance for the overall picture that he's trying to point to.
Yeah, no, I think so as well. A guesstimate should suffice here. We can move on.
Next one we'll move to is, what do you know, number 2. That's where my attention span for this chapter was at its peak. I think, but wait, there's real reason to it, because this is cause. This is the 4 causes of Aristotle, which I think are going to be good to cover here, because it is, when you learn about Aristotle, almost the first thing you learn about is his 4 causes. It's so there and well known, because it is like a nice kind of categorical scheme. I think this is also something that is still thought with today. These are, again, the concepts that have like stood the test of time. They haven't stood the test of science in modern science, because the material cause seems to be one of just the most important, and the efficient cause, in like the law of motion, for Newton, that which stays at rest remains at rest until another force acts upon it. That's sort of the efficient cause, just in Newtonian language. And a lot of other science and the metaphysical underpinnings of science is the material cause. Understanding the substance of things are in their material, atomic, and molecular compounds is what is ultimately at play here. When you go to those very micro levels of analysis is where you can see the truth of something, because everything laddered on top of that is just stemming from that prior source. There's problems with that, but it's just to show the relevance that Aristotle has. And the hot take I've kind of had at the beginning is science has forgotten 2 of the most important cause, the formal and the final cause. And part of what we're lacking in the meaning crisis is a science of that level of classification. And the paradox is that you can't have a science to do that level of classification, because it reduces the cognizing subject, it reduces values, and it wants to objectify things. And that's what it's good at doing, and that's what it should be doing, but it shouldn't be overgeneralizing and extending to something like the human realm of values. I'll do a quick run over these, and then we can probably move on in a pretty succinct fashion. The material cause, these can all be thought of like the 4 becauses. Like, why does something happen? If we want to explain anything, Aristotle thinks we can reduce it, we can see it through this lens. Firstly, the material cause. that from which, as immanent material, a thing comes into being, e.g., the bronze is the cause of the statue. Why is the statue the way it is? Well, because it's made of bronze, it shines, it's firm, it's sturdy, and it's there like that because it's made of bronze. That's not all, though. Did the metal just mold itself into a statue? No, there had to be someone that was crafting it, and that is the efficient cause, that from which the change or the resisting from the change first begins. The examples Aristotle gives is the advisor is a cause of the action, the father a cause of the child. It's something that has inflicted its own will on something else to cause it to change. The formal cause is the formal pattern, i.e. the definition of the essence and the classes which include this. And so the formal cause is almost like the blueprint of something, what it is like, the look of it. And this is also how he includes that sort of mathematical truth and grounding that he knows, how you can represent something in essence through mathematics and through different forms of description, and that is almost like the blueprint. That is what the thing is. And so the example he gives here is
the word we've brought up a lot is eidos, right? It's the thing that makes the statue a statue and not a ring.
Yeah, and it's called the formal cause, and Plato had called it like the forms, and it's accounting for that in this. And so for Aristotle, and I think this is just a fact that still holds true, the ratio 2-to-1 and number in general are the causes of the octave. So when you, I'm not the musician here, but octaves are a certain doubling in frequency such that they still harmonize, but they are, the ratio of 2-to-1 hertz increased on the scale. Sid is nodding. And I've just given his away identity. What? Anyway, final cause. The final cause is the fourth and final cause, and it's the end, i.e. that for which the sake of a thing, e.g. health is the cause of walking. That for the sake of which a thing... Okay, I'm going to do this one again. The fourth and final cause that Aristotle has in the set is the final cause, and that's essentially the end to which something was done, or the final purpose that it serves. And this is where Aristotle opens it up to being a higher sense as well. So the sake of which something is done for. For example, you could be walking, you could be in a run club, you could be on there with your Strava buddies. Why? You could be following me and getting these juicy Aristotle quotes as I go for runs, but you're not, because I still only have about 3 people that are no, I'm joking. But you're doing that. Why? It's, it might be because it's fun in the moment, run is high. Could also be because you're looking to have a healthy lifestyle. You're looking to have that invigoration from exercise and be in a more healthy mindset and physical state. And that is the final cause of the running. The material cause is your body making those movements. Efficient cause, the muscles all contributing to this. The formal cause is, just the form of running and the mechanics of it, and, the innate propulsion and movement that exists within your body to be able to move yourself like that. Philosophy is electrical charge, but the final cause is aspiring to this, incarnation of health and to be more healthy.
What I've read over this type of thing so many times through Aristotle, watched videos and secondary texts and stuff as well. I think the final cause is the one I understand least. It's also famously the one that's been most obviously neglected in the modern world. Not in materialis, but in like our observations and connotations of it. I wonder though, do you think final cause is something that can be found along the way of the progression of the thing, or does it have to be baked in from the start and then only then does it occur? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yes, that's a great question. I think literature very much explores that question. Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist is all about, everything that is invoking is that the journey or the destination is really a commentary on the final cause that Aristotle had, put to paper a while ago. Now, it's not to say that he predicted it, but it's to say that what really interests us and captures our attention and our motivation is to understand something like final cause, like to understand our purpose. What is the meaning of life? Like a lot of these stem from our desire to, that we recognize that the final cause has some kind of placement, or we hope it has some kind of placement for us. And secondly, how we discover and find that. And I think of Forrest Landry here in his quote on meaning in life, and it's succinctly put, as Forrest Landry always does, to search for meaning is to find it. So in a way, the final cause is something that is found in the very...
If people don't know how smart that guy is, they'll think he's really stupid for saying that.
Yeah. And so I think it's a open-ended question. My sense for it would be, yeah, you can have things that just are, top down, have a final cause, but then also final causes can be discovered. It doesn't have to be put there through a cognizing subject. And it's a little more interesting when the final cause is discovered from something's existence, like from the existence preceding essence. The existentialist move would be an interesting way to think about final cause.
Nice, very nice. I have a few thoughts on that, but did you want to finish the causes talk?
No, I've finished on it. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to tell viewers that we're not paid by Paolo to plug The Alchemist. He hasn't reached out to us to say, bring up the book and set Alex up with a question to answer. So he has to say the universe conspires and he has to bring my book up. But yeah, I think it's highly telling that it really enchants us and it really transfixes us when we consider the possibility as individuals in the modern world that matter reconfigures itself in front of us and personalizes itself for us. And that's why The Alchemist partially has sold hundreds of millions of copies. Is, wait, it's not just me as a passive receptor in a world of dead material. I can actually be an agent in an arena, like John Vervaeke's term. That's really, really exciting to us. And it's strange how much uplift we feel experientially from it when it's just so obvious, I think. But it's one of those things that's being neglected across so many generations that I guess it's not so obvious anymore. I want to just raise one immediate counter argument to the four causes. There's many, but one of the most obvious and notorious ones is that everything Aristotle is saying holds true for Greek thought. And you mentioned the difference between science and techne and kind of more applied and implementable knowledge of things, contact epistemology, even as differing from the man in the lab coat in the lab. So do the four causes apply for the statue, for the chalice because it's handicraft, but not for modern machine-powered technology? Yeah, I guess the last 200 years, is that too different from the material conditions that he inhabited? And does that change anything as to the lived reality of the four causes as a condition for being, or rather for emergence and poiesis? And then I also wanted to bring in spirit as a concept, because obviously we're talking about causes, but we've also undergone a serious, I guess, exploration of the dynamic model of the unconscious and the psyche more widely. And where does something that has a genuine place in our heuristics today, like the collective unconscious, fit into this? In what ways is that impacting and influencing consequence and the transpiration of events occurring? there are things, there's much to be said about the energy and the spirit of Wotan driving Hitler, and Hitler being possibly the most talked about name and person in the last 100, no, definitely, maybe aside from Michael Jackson, the person most mentioned, most hyperlinked, the things from which most things are derived. And somehow there's this Reddit 4chan thing from like 2016 where someone was saying you're only ever 2 degrees of separation away from Hitler in communication. Like any conversation can devolve into a conversation filled with the name Hitler and like a discussion of what happened. And I mean, yeah, when someone is that interwoven into the fabric of our superstructures mentally, it's worth understanding that someone like him was infamously driven by what a lot of people in retrospect call the collective conscious and unconscious. And that's something that's completely absent in Aristotle, obviously just not his fault, but it just is. And also just with the, understanding that that's just one interpretation of 1940s Germany. I don't believe that, but whatever, that's a separate, neither here nor there thing. I'm going to make a separate video for those that are attached to Lucatella, the YouTube channel, about World War II and alternative history takes and stuff. Anyway, the other thing is, one definition I came across for spirit itself, which I think is really relevant here, is, and rather troubling in keeping with what we've spoken about with the modern day individual, but spirit is defined as spontaneous movement and activity, spontaneous capacity to produce images independently of sense perception, and autonomous manipulation of these images. So you kind of think, it's a marionette situation. Who's the puppeteer? Who's the one pulling the strings? And things start to get really freaky when you dabble into things like the self, coming from Jung. So yeah, there's that whole angle that is really intriguing to it, that adds to it a lot as well. We know that one thing that definitely happens if you take a warrior dose of psychedelics is a serious reshuffling of your priorities. Who's causing that? What's causing that? We can't just say machine elves every time. So yeah, there's that.
Love it. I'll move on to the next one, and there's just a few more terms to go by. And I mean that first one was really helpful and kind of deepened even just talking about it here. Understanding of beginning and cause. So let's try out another one, and that is nature. So we've known that, and I think it's important because and links back to these conversations we've been having from onset. Aristotle is wanting to put the forms back into nature. It's almost like Plato took them out and abstractified them, and Aristotle is wanting to actually see them as being immanently incarnated in natural things. And so with that as background, the 5 kind of definitions of nature, or the 5 ways that we understand nature in the Greek time, was the genesis of growing things. Secondly, the immanent part of a growing thing from which its growth first proceeds. Thirdly, the source from which the primary movement in each natural object is present in its Thirdly, the source from which the primary movement in each natural object is present in virtue of its own essence. Fourth, nature means the primary material of which any natural object consists, or out of which it is made, which is relatively unshaped and cannot be changed from its own potency. For example, bronze is said to be the nature of a statue, so like that inseparability. And fifth, nature means the essence of natural objects, as with those who say the nature is the primary mode of composition. So I think a little more technical in that, but it's talking about like essentially that moving principle, the genesis of a growing thing, or the immanent part of a growing thing from which its growth first proceeds. So it is essentially honoring the fact of propulsion and movement. And for Aristotle, he would, and in the physics book again, he commentates on how, although the material conditions of a tree and a bed that you've constructed from cutting that tree is the same, both made of the same timber, the tree has this innate principle of motion within it, has its own genesis of to grow, but a bed frame just doesn't have that same movement. It has been, and what's happened there to take something in nature and, cut it down to, saw it into different pieces and fix it in a certain way, really tight and fitted, and have it sanded back and assemble it in a very specific structurally integrous manner, means that you've really taken nature and slaughtered it to fit it into something artificial and something technological. I think it's interesting because Aristotle holds that distinction of natural versus artificial things is that difference of having an innate principle of like motion and rest in natural things. But I think where we've got to with technology is an interesting case of showing how our own material conditions are no longer, unmovable in themselves. Like even in this space of, there's almost like this dreamlike capacity to things that are material and technological or electrical charge. They have their own generative capacity. And so I think there's a way in which this kind of understanding of nature it either brings like technology into like a natural process, or there's something in the concept that needs to be moved and changed to kind of define nature as separate from technology.
Yeah, totally. I think Aristotle is trying to do exactly that, trying to bring the forms fundamentally back into nature after Plato perhaps removed them, is what you said a bit earlier on. I think that the word that kept coming to mind as you were talking was autopoiesis, which obviously originates from, I think, around the time of Aristotle, but they used it slightly differently again. But essentially, a partial synonym might be self-creation. But when you take that idea seriously, you start to end up in an area where Aristotle is vindicated, right? He's trying to move slowly us towards the conceptual idea that substances are actually in this world and we can study them. And that's the pinnacle of philosophy, is metaphysics. And metaphysics incorporates increasing levels of understanding of substance. And for something to exist, for there to be thing and a boundary and then not thing, there has to be a boundary from the thing and the environment. And where autopoiesis fits in is even like, so this exists for, say, things you can touch and sit on, feel, all the way down to things that you're doing that with but not aware of, like cells. Things like, obviously this pertains more to living organisms, but essentially they're most fundamentally a network of interactions, right? So this again brings in a lot of 20th century thought, but I think this was predated in the Greek conception of autopoiesis, where they say that it's a thing is a network of interactions that actively produces its own component parts that constitutes it, which is like pretty whack and crazy of a thing to say. It's almost the same thing that you would expect them to say entirely inverted. And yeah, just the other thought I had as you were talking was about the removal of reality and forms themselves from nature. Aristotle distinguishes in one of the sections I was going to bring up called prior and posterior. I'll just weave it in now and then we don't have to do it at all because this is the main part. He basically distinguishes between the cognitively prior and the perceptibly prior. And he says with cognition, it is the universals that are prior, and with perception, it's the particulars that are prior. So he almost makes that bifurcation explicit, which is quite nice to see. He can do that because he comes after Plato chronologically. So I guess it's a bit easier, but it's still nice to see that. But yeah, essentially like something like a tree is prior and greenness, the quality, the fundament of greenness would be posterior, which is stating the obvious, but it also just shows his naturalism and Aristotelian materialism that is in full flux, which is awesome. You're muted, by the way.
I'm a boomer. Okay. It's also making that distinction of, yeah, like knowing when we're talking about an essence or a substance, when there is nothing that's prior and that there's only posterior attributes that we can like make claims about, is when we know we're at the formal cause, or we're at the depiction of something in it. We're at its eidos, essentially, the thing that it is, because there's nothing behind which is giving more of its presentation to us. I think as well, just to kind of wrap up nature here in the discussion on it, was that there is actually ways that, and obviously, so I wasn't saying that it's not, but there's parts of the concept and term which are maybe, it's just bringing in the question, and it's more in that space of speculative philosophy of the role of technology and nature and how we want to define that. It's an ongoing debate that's been happening, ad infinitum. But an interesting part that Aristotle points to here is how in a natural thing, it is the case that you have that bidirectional relationship of like potentiality and actuality, of the form and the matter. In a natural thing, the matter does have a direct relationship to its form. The matter of the tree is related deeply to the form of the tree, of that growing and branching and unfolding organism. And inversely as well, in a natural thing, the form is there and is completely connected to its matter. Like it is defined by its matter in a very reciprocitous way. And so you have that connection between these two essential components of something. But when you take, the wood and put it into a bed, and you have that, you don't have that same relationship. The form of the bed is not determined by its material, because you could have, an iron bed, you could have, cardboard, you could, do whatever, and it's still a bed. The form of bed can be completely changed depending on its material substrate when it's an artificial thing. But a natural thing, you don't have that same separability in its material, and it's in its materiality and its essentiality.
Yeah, I think you put it very paradigmatically last episode, or the one before that, where you said, I'm paraphrasing, but the prime psychological project of our modern condition might be to imbue matter with spirit, which just ties a lot of this in poetically, I think.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, I have
we can conclude the nature stuff here if you want.
Yep. I have one more to take us to, which is substance. We've talked about it a lot, and it would be worthwhile to give it the Aristotelian treatment. In Greek, the word is ousia, and really it means in its definition that which is, and it's also, you could say, beingness, or presence. Like it's that almost ephemeral there-ness of something. And you can see how there's almost a Heideggerian lens of that you could apply here, just that something is, that quality of its positivity, of its existence, is here. And so when we get into what Aristotle has to say about it, he says, 4 different senses of substance. One, the simple bodies, i.e. earth and fire and water and everything of the sort, and in general, bodies and the things composed of them, both animals and divine beings, and all the parts of these. All these are called substance because they are not predicated of a subject, but everything else is predicated of them. So from that, it's this coming back to what there is no priors of, but what everything is predicated of. And it's, for him coming down to these like fundamental elements. He's got earth, fire, water, etc. But I think in today's kind of language, we wouldn't have to be thinking about it in such an elemental way, though we could. but you would, even think about it more as, I'm even thinking of like subject and object as, some of these elemental kind of concepts that we have today.
I was hearing a bit
Secondly,
of the relational ontologies of today in their nascent form and what he's saying there.
yeah, and how it's then we take a similar notion like substance, but we don't apply it to a thing, we apply it to a relationship, which is, a kind of a non-thing that holds things together, and that's more of the essential substance of being.
Yeah. And we apprehend the thingness in that which constitutes its validity as substance.
Yeah, the thingness of relationship. Yeah. Secondly, that which, being present in such things as are not predicated of a subject, is the cause of their being, as the soul is of the being of an animal. So essentially, cause of their being. Is that almost like a fifth cause that he's wanting to bring in, or is it just, the cause of their being would be, these four causes arranged in a certain configuration, knowing that something can have like multiple causes stacked up? He would be saying that it is that which gives cause to their existence. And again, when we think of this definition in terms of that which is or presence, we can see that just interwoven in, the there-ness of something. And that is kind of, it's also a way to see its substance, like that it presents itself.
The latter is what it sounds more like. It's the composition that's the fifth element, perhaps.
Yeah. Thirdly, the parts which are present in such things, limiting them and marking them as individuals, and by whose destruction the whole is destroyed. There's a lot packed into that one, because you have, it's the thing that limits it, but if it's destroyed, then the thing itself is destroyed. So it's almost the containment of something, like the fact that it is there in a particular determination is its substance. And if you didn't have that particular determination, if you maybe expanded one area, if something didn't have to be a certain color, or it didn't have to have 4 legs, it could have 8 legs, then okay, you're getting from like a mammal to an arachnid, and it destroys what was there previously. So the substance is also like the container by which something presences itself and exists in and is dependent on that.
Wow, that's actually rather profound, right? It's not just the existence which constitutes the causes, it's the precise configuration that's equally important. Things held in this delicate tightrope walker-esque balance.
Yeah, things that have in some sense a relationship to their self-relating negativity.
Yeah,
Right. So you have
indwelling in it, yeah.
yes. And yeah. Fourthly, the essence, the formula of which is a definition, is also called the substance of a thing, of each thing. So the definition, the essence is also the substance. So that's, kind of just making it very practically here to understand, like, this is what we say it is. And he's saying, if we're describing the form, that we're not describing kind of its potential, we're describing what it is. And so we're getting more at the soul of a thing, and that soulness of it is also its substance. So it's this animation that limits it, that could destroy it if it wasn't there, that presence is it. Like, all of these qualities start to stack up, and we start to actually understand what substance is. And I'll just say that there's a video on screen now that is done by Johannes Niederhauser, a German philosopher, and he really clearly elucidates this concept of substance and also contrasts it to substrate, and shows how they have this co-determination of each other, or there's like a dialectic between these concepts at the very foundation. And it's a good way to understand substance in the Greek use of the word and in its relation to these other concepts that Aristotle was thinking about it. Substance isn't something that stands alone, but it stands there in relation to the substrate, which is, the kind of potential beneath it. So I encourage anyone that's interested in this part specifically, that's another great resource to help deepen and further your own thought of this.
Absolutely. And what I would say, what I was really strongly hearing in that specifically was Aristotle kind of paying heed to a gathering together motion of what I know today and register as the normative, the nomological, and the narrative, and things that are offshoots like determinants, determinacies, and derivatives are all actually intimately involved in the process itself. So much so that they are literally part and parcel, right? The famous discussion of, is the 10 Commandments a story? Well, it's an extraction and an abstraction and an application of a story, or the story is an abstraction or an application of that. But ultimately, yeah, like it's so intimately involved that it is the thing itself in a sense. Not in itself, but the thing itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, that wraps the words I had to bring. I don't know if you had any other final thoughts, but it feels like there's a pretty natural closing place on our horizons.
The only thing I was going to say is completely unrelated, but I learned a new word from this section, which was entelechy or entelechy. Have you heard that?
What is its English translation?
It's basically just the realization of potential. So once potential shifts into actual, assuming there's a difference at all, which for Aristotle it's more complex than that. It's an entelechy or entelechy taking place.
Hmm. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. The only thing, did I have anything to add? Let me see. I guess just, yeah, like a final thought would be, I want to keep, not that it needs resuscitating or revivifying, but something that's really just kind of either manifest or latent, but always existent in our conversations, is the recurrence of this paradox idea. Inversion as being like the norm, inversion as non-transgression, this kind of thing. I was really struck by this idea that might tie some of this stuff together in this past week, of Nietzsche's idea of the untimely, and kind of doing a deep dive into that. What does that mean? Like, because I'm so transfixed by the image of the shaman around the fire and the trickster and the vaudevillian nature of Maya and Leela, and how they all weave in together. But yeah, I came across this idea that through Nietzsche we learn about the untimely. We forget history, aka truth unfolding in time, the eternal, aka timeless truth, presentism, aka we are products of our time. What we strive to be is untimely. And I'm kind of thinking of the historicity idea here as well, of you're not like, through historicity, you have a high level of reflection and self-awareness of your present condition, and you are necessarily a Dasein, like unavoidably so, ineluctably so, but also by that same existence of being in the very much what Hegel calls the punctual present, the very here, the very now, you're also neither of those things. It's just that same old paradox thing of, yeah, like kind of, to say that something is anachronistic is to be tautological. Of course it is. But then at the same token, by the same token, saying that something is contemporary is also tautological. Of course, we're all present products of our time, and there's this
The untimely in Nietzsche is to be dancing around the fire rather than sitting around it and talking stories of past. Like, he partly had that as a concept, as a critique of German culture, as being shallow and overly historical for his time, and for Nietzschean standards, right? And he wanted to bring in this strong component of creativity and being ahead of one's time, being able to almost sublate it and then take it further. So that new cultural creation and artistic, realization of paradox, right? That revealed truth through paradox is partly like where Nietzsche goes with it. So yeah, I think it's a lovely term to bring in. And not one that I've had brought up so much, and I think it captures something, right? Like, to be untimely means to be like one right here, right now, but also looking into the future possibility space.
Yeah, and I think that was his very explicit, refutation of Wagner. Eventually, was that he was a overly historical being, and that kind of thing devolves into nationalism, patriotism, jingoism, or the precise antithesis of all those things. You hate your own borderlines, essentially, and so I mean, the twin danger of that is always its peril. The quote that I was going to read out is. The untimely is out of joint with the present, acting counter to our time, and thereby acting on our time for the benefit of a time to come. So that's not from Zarathustra, but it's very Zarathustrian. We're not interested in from what you're free, right? Many a slave hath cast away his final worth when he cast away his servitude. We're interested in for what you're free, and the fertile grounds of creation are only available to us when we kind of unshackle and emancipate ourselves, and that's only possible when you are the most bound up you've ever been. But I guess it's that idea again of configuration, right? Like, substance isn't simply about verifying existence, it's about the modes of occasioning and like fittedness. Again, Aristotle as the guy of fittedness in the configuration that you experience. So as a ground of creation, you want to have not no problems, nor do you want every problem in the world, because you're not a monk and you can't handle it, but you want a right amount of problems. And not only that, you want the right amount of problems designated, earmarked, shoehorned into you, for you, by God. So again, it goes to fittedness. I think fittedness, untimeliness, and paradox as ways and methods of attaining increasing levels of truth.
Very well said. I'm a little bit, as we draw to a end on this, like, and anticipating the next episode on book Epsilon is when we get into being and Aristotle's thoughts on it, on accidental being and necessary being. It feels like a precipice. Feels like we've contained so much and allowed it to discharge in this conversation and to be expressed and ripple through energetically. It's been such a pleasure to be untimely with you. And I think as well, like, you're in the good old days when you're in the days which you were present and you were forward thinking and you were getting to the future. So just a few closing remarks and appreciating the beauty of this chat.
Thank you so much, man. That means a lot for you joining us on this, say, voyage ride through the canals of Venice. It's an absolute treat. And we're very much in the good old days. And part of the reason we can recognize that gracefully is because we have the right amount of carbs in our body. We said this in episode 1 off of Ecce Homo, is the physiological underpinnings and conditions to be here and to do this now. So we're in the punctual present. We are the punctual present, and God be with us. And go on.
You paused at a great moment there, but also the how close we are to the circadian rhythm is another one of these factors, like having that sleep cycle regulated and intentionally so, is another philosophy of physiology.
Absolutely. And like, when we listen back to this discussion, or whoever's listening to it, thank you for staying along this long, and make sure to thank us as well in the comments for staying up way past our bedtime. But like, the condition and the I guess the environment in which they listen to this is going to be remarkably distinct as well as an experience. Are they running while listening to this? Are they sitting? Are they discussing, pausing, making notes? Are they doing none of those things and just kind of background noise? All of that will add up to be a fruitful experience or non-experience based on.
Totally. How was your day? How is your mood state feeling? How are you feeling for your future? How are you feeling about your past? Allow all of that to be embraced in your listening ship.
It's been a privilege, Alexis, and from myself here, named Lucatella, a very heartful goodbye to you and to all listeners.